what are some of the options on the table for Puerto Rico in terms of, do we continue with this arrangement? Do we move towards independence? Can we talk a little bit about what the political situation, how we can resolve what's on the table to resolve the political situation that might sort of help Puerto Rico along?
This is a very divisive debate in Puerto Rico. So much so that it's been very difficult for much attention to be allocated to anything other than this. And that has been really detrimental to Puerto Ricans and Puerto Rico in general. There's so much attention given to the question of status that there haven't been many deep discussions around what are viable economic development options for Puerto Rico, other than what has already been tried and failed. So how divisive is this? This is so divisive that in Puerto Rico, political parties are mostly organized around their status preferences. The problem with that is that it basically allows a lot of these parties to have really bad platforms, horrible policy ideas, a general inability to implement good policies. But they get a pass because people are organized politically around which status option they prefer. So everything else, our views on education, on healthcare, on food, energy, water, how to handle all of these things, climate, that is relegated to a second plane, and the status question is given priority. There's also an issue with analyzing which status option is better. Why? Because there are few comparable places. When you consider the case of Puerto Rico, it's hard to say, would Puerto Rico be better off as an independent country or as a state? Because there are very few places that are like Puerto Rico that are currently a state. And there are very few places like Puerto Rico and its history and what it's gone through that are independent countries. So that's an issue with trying to say one or the other is better than the other. The other issue too, however, given these issues, there are folks who have forwarded a discourse around which option is better and what kind of implications this would have for our economy. So some have said that, of course, if Puerto Rico were to be a state, it would immediately gain access to certain social policies and federal spending that it currently doesn't have access to. And few dispute this perspective. However, others have argued against that point and said that what gives Puerto Ricans any kind of certainty that access to those social policy expenditures is enough to bring Puerto Rico out of its economic crisis. Because if you look at the United States, and particularly the continental United States, there are a lot of states that aren't doing very well economically, and whose population, particularly its ethnic and racial minorities, are not doing very well. And it's a place where you have gender wage gaps, racial wage gaps, wealth gaps as well, and very few measures being adopted to address this at the current time. Some pro-statehood supporters have said, well, I believe in a more progressive future of the United States and are invested in struggling for that kind of future, and believe that under that kind of more progressive United States, Puerto Rico could succeed. Also, there's the pressures of becoming a state because a lot of Democrats are excited about the prospect, or so they believe, of having two more senators and more members of Congress that presumably would be Democrat.
Right.
Some have said that's not a certainty. The organized Republican Party and Republican views, conservative views in Puerto Rico have grown. And some might argue that they've been there for a long time, but now they have political power. And there have been statewide elected officials who are members of the Republican Party. A very powerful wing of the pro-statehood party is Republican. So there's no certainty that Puerto Rico, if it were to become a state, it would automatically grant the Democrats a huge advantage over Republicans.